The sterile corridors of St. Mary's Private Hospital echoed with the familiar sounds of modern medicine as Dr. Katerina Volkov moved through the halls with practiced grace. At 42, she had achieved everything she had dreamed of when she first immigrated to America from Moscow 20 years ago, with nothing but a medical degree, broken English, and unshakable determination to build a better life. The journey had been far from easy. Those early years in America had been filled with challenges that would have broken a lesser person. Working as a hospital janitor while studying for her medical licensing exams, living in a cramped studio apartment in the worst part of the city, enduring the subtle discrimination that came with being a foreign-born doctor with a heavy accent. But Katerina had persevered through sheer force of will and an almost obsessive dedication to excellence. She had retaken her medical boards 3 times until she achieved a perfect score, worked double shifts as a resident while her American-born colleagues complained about the hours, and spent every free moment studying English until she could speak without any trace of her Russian origins. The transformation had been remarkable. She was now the head of cardiology at one of the city's most prestigious private hospitals, commanded respect from her colleagues, and had built a reputation as one of the finest heart surgeons on the East Coast. Yet despite all her professional success, Katerina often felt a nagging sense of incompleteness. She had sacrificed everything for her career, personal relationships, hobbies, even basic pleasures like vacations or social gatherings. Her life had become a carefully choreographed routine of surgery, research, and teaching, with little room for anything that wasn't directly related to medicine. Her personal life was practically non-existent. She had dated occasionally over the years, but relationships always seemed to fall apart under the pressure of her demanding schedule and single-minded focus on her career. Most men found her intensity intimidating, and she had little patience for people who didn't share her commitment to excellence. Her modest apartment looked more like a medical library than a home, with walls lined with textbooks and medical journals, the coffee table covered with research papers. The morning that would change everything had started like any other. Katerina's alarm clock had buzzed at 5:15 a.m. in her immaculate apartment. She had followed her usual routine, 20 minutes on the treadmill while reading the latest cardiac surgery journals, a breakfast of yogurt and coffee while reviewing the day's surgical cases, and a precisely timed departure that would get her to the hospital exactly 30 minutes before her first scheduled procedure. At the hospital, Katerina's morning routine was as precisely choreographed as everything else in her life. She arrived at 6:30 a.m., reviewed patient charts over her usual black coffee in the doctor's lounge, and began her rounds by 7 a.m. She made it a point to personally check on every patient under her care, reading their charts thoroughly and speaking with the nursing staff about any changes in condition. Today's schedule was particularly challenging. She had 3 surgeries planned: a routine bypass on a 60-year-old construction worker whose insurance had finally approved the procedure after months of bureaucratic delays, a valve replacement on a middle-aged teacher who had been waiting 6 weeks for an opening in Katerina's schedule, and a complex procedure on a patient who had been transferred from the public hospital after his insurance situation had been mysteriously resolved overnight. It was this last case that would prove to be the turning point in her carefully ordered life. The patient's name was Viktor, and according to his chart, he was a 68-year-old Russian businessman who had suffered a massive heart attack 3 weeks earlier. The public hospital had stabilized him, but he needed immediate surgery to repair significant damage to his cardiovascular system. What made the case particularly interesting was not just the medical complexity, but the unusual circumstances surrounding his transfer. Public hospital patients were rarely moved to St. Mary's unless they had connections or resources that weren't immediately apparent. The fact that Viktor had specifically requested a Russian-speaking surgeon had prompted the hospital administration to reach out to Katerina, despite her already packed schedule. When Katerina entered room 314, she was immediately struck by the transformation that had taken place since Viktor's arrival. The standard hospital room had been converted into something resembling a luxury hotel suite. Fresh white roses filled crystal vases on every available surface, their fragrance creating an almost garden-like atmosphere. Original oil paintings had been hung on the walls, replacing the generic hospital artwork. A Persian rug covered the institutional linoleum floor, and expensive leather furniture had been brought in to replace the standard hospital chairs. The level of luxury was unlike anything Katerina had ever seen in a hospital room. Even their wealthiest patients rarely went to such lengths to customize their accommodations. It spoke to resources that went far beyond typical affluence. In the corner of the room sat a man in an impeccably tailored suit, his posture suggesting military or security training. He was reading a newspaper in what Katerina recognized as Russian, occasionally glancing up to scan the room with alert, professional eyes. This was clearly more than just a family member or friend. He had the bearing of someone whose job was to ensure Viktor's safety and privacy. Viktor Kozlov himself was lying in the hospital bed, but even in his weakened state, he radiated an aura of power and authority that was impossible to ignore. He was a distinguished-looking man with thick silver hair that was perfectly styled despite his recent medical crisis, and intelligent gray eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with calculating precision. His hands, resting on the hospital blanket, showed signs of a life of privilege: manicured nails, no calluses, and an expensive watch that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Despite his recent heart attack, Viktor maintained the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of wielding significant power and influence. Even in a hospital gown, there was something regal about his bearing, as if he were accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. "Dr. Volkov," he said in Russian as she approached his bedside, his voice rough from the recent medical procedures but still carrying unmistakable command. "Thank you for agreeing to take my case. I've heard remarkable things about your skill as a surgeon, and I specifically requested you because I believe you're the only doctor in this city who can give me the level of care I require." Katerina felt a flutter of professional pride at his words, but also a twinge of curiosity about how he had come to know about her work in such detail. She approached his bedside with her usual professional warmth, switching effortlessly to her native language. Speaking Russian with patients always felt comfortable and natural. It reminded her of her roots and created an immediate connection that often helped in the healing process. "Mr. Kozlov, I've reviewed your files thoroughly, and I must say that your case is quite complex. The damage to your heart is significant, more extensive than the initial reports from the public hospital indicated. However, I'm confident that with proper surgical intervention, we can restore your cardiovascular function to near normal levels." Viktor nodded slowly, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made Katerina slightly uncomfortable. She was accustomed to patients being nervous before major surgery, asking detailed questions about risks and recovery times. But there was something different about Viktor's demeanor, something calculating and purposeful rather than anxious or fearful. "I have complete confidence in your surgical abilities," Viktor said, his tone suggesting that this confidence was based on extensive research rather than mere hope. "Your reputation precedes you, Dr. Volkov. I understand that you've successfully performed over 300 complex cardiac procedures with a success rate that exceeds even the best hospitals in Europe." Katerina was taken aback by the specificity of his knowledge about her surgical record. Patient research was one thing, but Viktor seemed to know details about her career that weren't publicly available. "Mr. Kozlov, I appreciate your confidence, but I have to ask, how do you know so much about my professional background?" "I make it my business to know everything about the people whose services I require," Viktor replied with a slight smile. "When your life depends on someone's skill, you don't leave anything to chance." Before Katerina could respond, Viktor shifted in his bed and fixed her with that calculating stare again. "But before we proceed with discussing the surgery, I have a proposition for you that I believe will interest you greatly." Katerina felt a flutter of unease. In her 15 years of practice, she had learned to be wary when wealthy patients began talking about propositions. Usually, it meant they wanted preferential treatment, expedited scheduling, or some other accommodation that compromised proper medical protocols. She had always refused such requests, regardless of the patient's wealth or influence. "Mr. Kozlov, I assure you that you'll receive the finest care available here at St. Mary's. Our surgical team is exceptional, and we follow protocols that ensure the best possible outcomes for all our patients. I don't make special arrangements based on a patient's ability to pay." Please, sit down, Viktor interrupted gently but firmly, gesturing to the expensive leather chair that had been placed beside his bed. What I have to discuss with you goes far beyond this surgery, and it has nothing to do with special treatment. Against her better judgment, Katerina found herself settling into the chair. There was something about Viktor's presence that commanded attention, a gravitational pull that successful people often possessed. She had encountered it before with CEOs and politicians who had been her patients, but Viktor's version seemed more refined, more purposeful. Dr. Volkov, tell me something, Viktor began, his voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow made his words more compelling. How much do you know about my business interests? Katerina shook her head firmly. I make it a practice not to research my patients' personal lives beyond what's medically relevant. My concern is solely with your health and recovery. Viktor's smile broadened, and for the first time since entering the room, Katerina saw genuine warmth in his expression. That response tells me everything I need to know about your character, and it confirms what my research suggested about your integrity. He gestured to the man in the corner, who immediately stood and approached with a leather portfolio that looked expensive enough to cost more than most people's monthly rent. Viktor opened it carefully and withdrew several documents, handling them with the reverence of someone presenting state secrets. Dr. Volkov, I own and operate a network of private medical facilities that spans 3 continents, Viktor began, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to making high-stakes business presentations. Hospitals, research facilities, medical training centers, pharmaceutical development labs. It's a multi-billion-dollar operation that serves some of the most influential people in the world. Katerina listened politely, but she was beginning to feel increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. She had work to do, other patients who needed her attention, and this felt more like a business meeting than a medical consultation. Her schedule was precisely planned, and extended conversations like this threw off her entire day. Mr. Kozlov, I appreciate you sharing this information with me, but I really should focus on your upcoming surgery. We can discuss your business interests after you've recovered. I want you to run it all, Viktor said simply, his words cutting through her polite dismissal like a surgical blade. The statement hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Katerina stared at him, certain she had misunderstood or misheard. The idea was so far outside the realm of possibility that her mind couldn't immediately process it. I'm sorry, what did you say? I want you to become the chief medical officer of my entire organization, Viktor repeated, his voice steady and serious. You would oversee medical operations across 17 facilities in 12 countries. You would have unlimited resources, access to the finest equipment money can buy, and the opportunity to perform procedures that push the absolute cutting edge of cardiac medicine. Katerina felt the room spinning slightly around her. The scope of what Viktor was describing was beyond anything she had ever imagined, even in her most ambitious dreams. Mr. Kozlov, I think you're seriously overestimating my qualifications. I'm a heart surgeon, not a healthcare administrator. I've never managed anything larger than a surgical team. You're much more than just a surgeon, Viktor interrupted, his intensity increasing. I've had investigators research your background exhaustively over the past 6 months. You're not just an exceptional surgeon, you're an innovative thinker who has published groundbreaking research on minimally invasive cardiac procedures. You've mentored dozens of young doctors who now work at premier medical facilities around the world. You have the rare combination of technical skill, leadership ability, and ethical integrity that my organization desperately needs. The mention of investigators sent a chill down Katerina's spine. The idea that someone had been researching her life without her knowledge was deeply unsettling. You've been investigating me for 6 months? Why? Because finding the right person for this position is crucial to the future of my organization, Viktor replied without hesitation. I needed to ensure that whoever I approached would have not just the medical expertise, but the character to handle the responsibilities that come with this role. Katerina's mind was reeling with questions and concerns. What exactly would this position involve? And why are you offering it to someone you've never met? Victor's eyes lit up with enthusiasm, and he leaned forward in his hospital bed despite the obvious discomfort the movement caused. You would have your own private jet to travel between facilities, allowing you to oversee operations and perform the most complex procedures at each location. A base salary of $12 million annually, plus performance bonuses that could easily double that amount. Your own research budget of $50 million per year to pursue whatever projects interest you most. The numbers were staggering. Katerina currently made $400,000 per year, which she had always considered an excellent salary that allowed her to live comfortably and save for retirement. What Viktor was describing would make her one of the highest-paid medical professionals in the world. But the financial benefits are just the beginning, Viktor continued, his voice growing more excited. You would have the opportunity to bring cutting-edge medical care to regions of the world that have never had access to this level of treatment. Imagine performing heart surgery in rural areas of Eastern Europe or Asia, saving lives that would otherwise be lost simply because of geographic limitations. Katerina felt a stirring of professional excitement despite her skepticism. The idea of bringing advanced cardiac care to underserved populations had always appealed to her, but the logistics and resources required had made it seem impossible. There would also be significant personal benefits, Viktor continued, pulling out additional documents from his portfolio. A penthouse apartment in Moscow overlooking Red Square, a villa in the Swiss Alps for when you need to escape the pressures of work, and a beach house in Monaco for relaxation. Full staff for all properties, luxury vehicles, and a comprehensive benefits package that includes healthcare, education allowances, and retirement planning that would set you up for life. The lifestyle Viktor was describing sounded like something from a movie rather than a realistic career opportunity. Katerina had always lived modestly, focusing on her work rather than material possessions. The idea of owning multiple luxury properties around the world was so foreign to her experience that she couldn't even properly imagine it. Mr. Kozlov, this all sounds incredible, but I have to ask, why me? Katerina said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. There must be hundreds of doctors with more experience in healthcare administration, people who have actually run large medical organizations. Viktor's expression grew serious, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion that hadn't been there before. Because you have something that can't be taught, bought, or faked, genuine integrity. I've spent 6 months having investigators examine every aspect of your professional and personal life. You've never taken shortcuts, never compromised patient care for profit, never let politics or personal gain influence your medical decisions. He paused, his gray eyes boring into hers with laser-like intensity. In my world, Dr. Volkov, that kind of ethical foundation is incredibly rare and infinitely valuable. I've worked with dozens of highly qualified doctors who were brilliant technically but who could be corrupted by money, power, or ego. I need someone who will make decisions based on what's best for patients, not what's most profitable. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Katerina's nurse, Maria Santos, peered into the room with an apologetic expression. Maria had worked with Katerina for over 5 years and knew her schedule better than anyone. Dr. Volkov, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have surgery scheduled in 30 minutes, and Dr. Hassan needs to consult with you urgently about the Peterson case. The patient's condition has deteriorated overnight. Katerina felt a moment of relief at the interruption. The intensity of Viktor's offer had left her feeling overwhelmed and uncertain, struggling to process the magnitude of what he was proposing. The familiar demands of her current job provided a welcome anchor to reality. Of course, Maria. Please tell Dr. Hassan I'll be right there. She turned back to Viktor with an apologetic smile. Mr. Kozlov, we'll need to continue this conversation later. Right now, I have patients who need immediate attention. Naturally, Viktor said with understanding, though she could see disappointment flicker across his features. Patient care must always come first. But please, take these materials and review them carefully. I'm not asking for an immediate decision, but I hope you'll give serious consideration to what I'm offering. He handed her the leather portfolio, which felt surprisingly heavy in her hands. There's detailed information about each facility, financial projections, research opportunities currently available, and a formal contract proposal. Everything is completely legitimate and above board. I've included references from medical professionals at each location who can verify the quality of our operations. Katerina accepted the portfolio reluctantly, feeling as if she were accepting a burden rather than an opportunity. Mr. Kozlov, I have to be completely honest with you. This sounds almost too good to be true, and in my experience, offers like this usually come with hidden costs or obligations that aren't immediately apparent. Viktor's expression grew appreciative rather than offended. I understand your skepticism, and I respect it completely. That kind of careful, analytical thinking is exactly what I need in someone who would oversee my medical operations. Yes, this is an extremely generous offer, but it's also a demanding position that would require significant personal sacrifices. What kind of sacrifices? Katerina asked, her curiosity overriding her caution. You would be traveling constantly, sometimes spending weeks at a time in remote locations where you might be the only qualified surgeon for hundreds of miles. You'd be working in high-pressure environments with patients whose cases have been deemed hopeless by other doctors. You'd be dealing with government officials, heads of state, and business leaders who require absolute discretion and have zero tolerance for failure. Viktor's voice grew more serious. This isn't just a job, Dr. Volkov. It's a complete lifestyle change that would consume your entire existence. The financial rewards are enormous, but they come at the cost of any semblance of a normal personal life. And if I were to accept this position, Katerina asked, surprised by her own question, when would you expect me to start? That would be entirely up to you, Viktor replied immediately. I understand that you have commitments here, patients who depend on you, colleagues who respect and rely on your expertise. I would never ask you to abandon your responsibilities or leave your patients without proper care. The generosity and flexibility of Viktor's approach only made Katerina more suspicious. In her experience, people with this level of wealth and power usually expected immediate compliance with their requests. The fact that he was willing to accommodate her schedule suggested either exceptional patience or ulterior motives she couldn't yet identify. During her lunch break, Katerina retreated to her small office and opened Viktor's portfolio with trembling hands. The contents were even more impressive than she had expected, laid out with the kind of attention to detail that suggested a massive investment in preparation. Detailed financial statements showed that Viktor's medical network was indeed worth billions of dollars and was experiencing rapid growth across multiple markets. The facilities themselves were documented with high-resolution photographs that revealed hospitals looking more like luxury resorts than medical centers, equipped with technology that was years ahead of what most institutions could afford. The research opportunities were particularly compelling for someone with Katerina's interests and ambitions. Viktor's organization had exclusive partnerships with major pharmaceutical companies, access to experimental treatments that weren't available elsewhere, and the resources to fund clinical trials that could advance medical knowledge by decades. But it was the patient testimonials that really captured her attention and began to shift her thinking about the offer. Letter after letter from people whose lives had been saved by Viktor's medical network, many of whom had been given up on by other doctors and medical institutions. Children with rare heart conditions who had received experimental treatments that cured them completely. Elderly patients who had been told they were too high risk for surgery but had been given new leases on life by innovative procedures that other hospitals wouldn't attempt. This is what medicine should be, Katerina thought to herself as she read through the testimonials. Resources unlimited by insurance restrictions, time to focus on the most complex cases, the ability to take calculated risks that could save lives that would otherwise be lost to bureaucratic caution. Over the following days, Katerina researched Viktor's organization with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to preparing for complex surgeries. She called medical professionals who had worked with his facilities, read every article she could find about his business dealings, and even hired a discreet private investigator to verify the information he had provided. The investigation yielded fascinating results. Viktor Kozlov was exactly who he claimed to be, a legitimate businessman who had built a medical empire through shrewd investments, strategic partnerships, and an apparent genuine commitment to providing high-quality healthcare. His facilities were consistently rated among the best in their respective regions, and the doctors who worked for him spoke highly of the resources available, the quality of equipment, and the freedom to practice medicine at the highest level. But there were also warnings that gave Katerina pause. Several people mentioned that Viktor could be extremely demanding and that he expected absolute loyalty and commitment from his employees. The work was described as intense, the travel exhausting, and the pressure to succeed enormous. One former employee described it as the most rewarding and most challenging experience of my medical career, but also the most consuming. On the day of Viktor's surgery, Katerina felt more nervous than she had experienced in years. It wasn't because of the medical complexity of the procedure; she had performed hundreds of similar operations with excellent outcomes. Her anxiety stemmed from the knowledge that Viktor's recovery would largely determine whether she could seriously consider his offer. The operation was scheduled for 7 hours, reflecting the extensive nature of the cardiovascular damage that needed to be repaired. Viktor's heart attack had been massive, affecting multiple arteries and requiring complex reconstruction that would test even Katerina's considerable skills. The surgery began at 7 a.m. and went flawlessly from the first incision. Viktor's heart damage was even more extensive than the initial scans had indicated, requiring innovative techniques that pushed the boundaries of current cardiac surgery. But Katerina's years of experience and natural surgical instincts served her well, and she was able to repair the damage with a precision and creativity that impressed even her experienced surgical team. When Viktor woke up the following morning alert and coherent, his first words demonstrated the mental acuity that had made him successful in the business world. "How did it go?" he asked in Russian, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube but his eyes sharp and focused. "Perfectly," Katerina replied with genuine warmth and professional satisfaction. "Your heart function should return to normal within a few weeks. You'll need to follow a strict rehabilitation program, but you should make a complete recovery and be able to return to all your normal activities." Viktor smiled weakly, but his expression showed profound relief. "I knew I chose the right surgeon. Your reputation for excellence is well deserved, Dr. Volkov. Now," he continued, his voice growing stronger despite his obvious fatigue, "have you had a chance to consider my offer?" Katerina had been dreading this moment, despite all her research and soul-searching over the past few days. Even after examining every aspect of Viktor's proposition, she still hadn't reached a final decision. "Mr. Kozlov, I've reviewed everything thoroughly, and I have to admit that your offer is incredibly compelling. But I still have serious concerns about making such a dramatic change in my life." "What concerns you most about the opportunity?" "Honestly, I'm worried about why you're making such an extraordinary offer to someone you've known for less than a week. In my experience, when something seems too good to be true, it usually is." Viktor was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes studying her face with the same intensity she had noticed during their first conversation. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion that completely transformed his demeanor. "Dar. Volkov, let me tell you something that's not in any of those documents, something that will help you understand why this is so important to me." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. 5 years ago, my daughter Anya needed emergency heart surgery while she was studying at Oxford. She collapsed during a lecture and was rushed to the nearest hospital, where she was treated by a cardiac surgeon who was technically competent but arrogant and careless. Viktor's voice grew heavy with emotion as he continued. The surgeon made a series of preventable mistakes during the operation, small errors in technique that individually might not have mattered, but together created complications that nearly killed my daughter. When I tried to hold him accountable, I discovered that the entire medical system was designed to protect doctors rather than patients. "What happened to your daughter?" Katerina asked softly, already dreading the answer. "She survived, but she has permanent damage to her heart that could have been completely avoided with proper surgical technique. She'll need ongoing monitoring and potential additional surgeries for the rest of her life, all because one doctor was more concerned with protecting his ego than admitting his limitations. Viktor's eyes filled with tears as he spoke about his daughter. That experience taught me that all the money in the world means nothing if you can't access competent, caring medical treatment when you need it most. I decided that day to build a medical network that would never allow that kind of preventable tragedy to happen to anyone else's family. Katerina felt a profound shift in her understanding of Viktor's motivations. This wasn't just about business success or personal legacy, it was deeply, personally important to him in ways that money could never address. That's why I need someone like you, Viktor continued, his voice growing stronger. A surgeon who cares more about doing things correctly than about protecting their reputation or maximizing profits. Someone who will never compromise patient care for personal convenience. Mr. Kozlov, I appreciate you sharing something so personal with me, Katerina said, feeling genuinely moved by his story. It helps me understand why this means so much to you. So will you consider it seriously? Viktor asked, hope evident in his voice. Katerina felt something shift inside her, a sudden clarity that surprised her with its certainty. I'll do more than consider it, she said, the words coming out before she had consciously decided to speak them. I accept your offer. Viktor's face lit up with genuine joy and relief. Are you certain? I don't want you to feel pressured into this decision. I'm certain, Katerina replied, and as she spoke the words, she realized she truly was. But I have several conditions that we'll need to discuss. Of course. Name them. First, I want to visit your facilities personally before I officially start. I need to see the operations firsthand, meet the medical teams I would be working with, and understand the day-to-day realities of the position. Absolutely. We can arrange comprehensive site visits to any and all facilities you want to see. Second, I want a 6-month trial period with clearly defined performance metrics. If either of us decides this isn't working out as expected, I should be able to return to my position here without penalty. Agreed completely. And third, I want meaningful input on hiring decisions for key medical positions throughout your network. If I'm going to be responsible for the quality of care across your entire organization, I need to ensure that we're bringing in doctors who share our commitment to excellence. That's exactly what I was hoping you would say, Viktor said with evident satisfaction. The next 3 months passed in a blur of intense activity and preparation. Katerina worked with the hospital administration to identify and interview potential replacements, gradually transferred her most complex cases to other qualified surgeons, and began the complex process of learning about Viktor's medical network in unprecedented detail. She traveled to facilities in Moscow, Singapore, Geneva, and Dubai, spending weeks at each location to understand the operations, meet the staff, and evaluate the quality of care being provided. What she found exceeded even Viktor's glowing descriptions. The facilities were equipped with technology that was years ahead of what most hospitals could afford, staffed by medical professionals who were genuinely committed to excellence, and operated with a level of efficiency and patient focus that she had never seen before. 6 months later, Katerina was overseeing medical operations across 17 facilities and had successfully performed dozens of groundbreaking procedures that were advancing the field of cardiac surgery. She had assembled a team of world-class doctors who shared her commitment to excellence, and together they were providing life-saving care to patients who had nowhere else to turn. Viktor had kept every promise he had made during that first conversation in his hospital room. The salary was exactly as described, the resources were truly unlimited, and the support for her medical decisions was absolute. More importantly, he had given her the opportunity to transform not just her own career, but the lives of countless patients who benefited from the exceptional care his medical network provided. Sometimes the most important decisions come disguised as impossible opportunities. For Dr. Katerina Volkov, The willingness to take a calculated risk on something that seemed too good to be true had led to a career that exceeded her wildest dreams and gave her the platform to make a difference in the world of medicine that she never could have imagined possible.